Welcome to Heartbreak Revealed. Discover real stories of wives, betrayals, and shocking twists. Hit subscribe button and let's get to our story.
Dave is one of the toughest men I've ever come across, a guy who doesn't say much. So it's on me to tell his story. You might think I'm making it up, but I swear on my grandfather's grave, it's true. Well, he's still alive, but you get the point. I pieced together this tale from chats with his wife, friends, and other folks in town. By the way, I'm Mike, a reporter with the Albany Herald. You probably noticed I didn't include Dave himself as a source. That's because I only got him to talk to me once, and all he said was, "My dad used to tell me, don't do anything if you can help it, and if you do, don't say a word." That's all I got out of him. But I've gathered enough info, and it's strange enough that I'm thinking of writing a book. It'll be as much about small-town life as it is about cheating and the actions of an extraordinary man. A guy of average intelligence who, when faced with the choices our modern courts offer, decided to take matters into his own hands. To be fair, this is my take on things. As I said, Dave doesn't talk much. My main source was his wife, who spilled everything, mainly because I promised her a couple of grand. She needed that to cover her legal bills. Let me set the scene. When this story begins, Dave and his wife were living in a secluded town of about 18,000 people with their 3 kids, Emma, 16, Jake, 15, and Max, 13. Dave was a mechanic, and his wife worked for the town's biggest shot, a real old-school bully who owned the largest auto dealership in the area. Everyone knew that the long-serving mayor was retiring in a couple of years, and this guy was the top contender to replace him. Top, because all the other candidates dropped out, citing personal reasons. Like I said, he's an old-school bully. The town had its own newspaper, which until very recently showed zero interest in the story of Dave and his wife. Can't blame them. The paper's owner drove a car with the dealership sticker on the back window. I, on the other hand, work for a major newspaper based in the state capital. I got bullied in school, so even if this wasn't a juicy story, I'd still want to get involved in Dave's fight against the town's Goliath. Anyway, on with the story. Judy stifled a scream into the pillow under her face as the man above her finished. She was glad, for that pillow faking the right expressions would have been too much of a task. As she struggled to breathe under Ronnie's relaxed weight, she thought about how things hadn't always been like this. At the start of their affair, the newness and the thrill of it all had brought her real pleasure. But now, the routine, the lack of romance, and the guilt were ruining the excitement she craved. Ronnie wasn't a bad lover, and his tools were more than adequate, but an hour in a dingy motel just didn't cut it for her anymore. When she started the affair 8 months ago, she imagined Ronnie was more of a powerhouse, but he was about the same as her husband Dave. At first, the novelty made it different, exciting even. But without the long, romantic build-up that women in their late 30s desire, the sex just became mechanical. She knew that would change eventually. Ronnie was going places, and she planned to be there for the romantic dinners and tender love she wanted. She didn't love Ronnie, but that was fine because she didn't love Dave either. It was enough for her to know that Ronnie loved her, and she figured she'd grow to love him in time. Only 3 things worried her about her perfect plans. First, her guilt. Her strict religious parents would never approve of what she was doing or planning to do to Dave. She wasn't looking forward to that conversation with her husband. Though she didn't love him, she did respect him as a loyal, hardworking man trying to do his best for their family. It was just too bad his best wasn't good enough for her. The second issue was that Ronnie refused to divorce his cold wife until he actually became mayor. That condemned her to these quick motel meetings instead of the all-night sessions she wanted. Back in the present, as her passion faded, guilt started creeping in. Ronnie rolled off her and began dressing. As usual, she would shower and leave at least an hour after him. That way, no one would see them arrive or leave together. Ronnie kissed her goodbye and reached for the door when she reminded him, "Check the window and make sure no one we know is around." Ronnie opened the curtains and glanced out, but suddenly drew back and let them fall. "Judy, there's a guy sitting on the hood of your car. He saw me open the curtain and looked right at me." "What?" Judy jumped out of bed and peeked out. "That's Dave. Your husband?" "Yes." "How did he know I was here?" "I'm not ready for this conversation yet, Ronnie. This could ruin our plans. What's he going to do?" "No lawyer in this town will take his case. I'll make sure of that this afternoon. But he might go to the media." Ronnie laughed. "In this town? I don't think so." They know better than to publish anything bad about me. They know I'll run this place for the next 10 years or until I move on to state politics. Don't worry about them. Anyway, this could be good. You're always saying we don't get enough time together. Now he knows. That could change. What's he going to do about it? I mean, look at the guy. He's shorter than me by a good 6 inches and half my weight. He could tell your wife. Ronnie paused. You're right about that. I don't want her getting wind of this before we're ready. I'll go talk to him. Ronnie bent down to kiss her again and marched out the door. Judy cracked the curtains to see the confrontation. She looked straight into her husband's eyes, then let the curtain drop and felt guilt gnawing at her. She waited a few minutes until she heard Ronnie's raised voice, then peeked out again. What she saw was very unsettling. Ronnie was towering over Dave, who still sat on her car. Once again, their eyes locked through the curtain. She fled to the bathroom and showered until the water ran cold, but she still couldn't wash the guilt away. She dressed and steeled herself to look out the window again when Ronnie called. How fast did your husband leave after I talked to him? I don't know. I haven't looked since you left. Well, check again. Judy mustered up some courage and peeked out through the curtains. He's still there. Ronnie sounded confused. He's still there? What did you say to him? I told him the facts of life, pointed out the health risks of standing in our way, and how pointless it would be to try to do anything about it. What am I going to do? I can't leave while he's out there. You'll be fine, Judy. It'll be dark soon. Stay put, and I'll send some of my guys over to have a word with him. True to his word, an hour later, there was a heavy knock on her door. Judy looked out and saw Frank and Rick, two of Ronnie's employees, standing outside the door, holding Dave between them. They were so big that Dave's feet were off the ground. She opened the door, and they shuffled in. Dave had a neutral expression and just stared at Judy. She quickly looked away and headed for the door. But then she heard a sickening thud behind her, followed by a gasp. Reflexively, she turned to look and saw Rick holding Dave while Frank had his fist cocked again. As she watched, Dave stood up straight and looked her directly in the eye. Feeling sick, she fled. She picked up some takeout on the way home for her family. When they asked where their dad was and why he wasn't answering his phone, she mumbled something vague. She barely slept that night, and there was still no sign of her husband when she left for work the next day. Ronnie wasn't in that day either, and she couldn't bring herself to speak to Frank or Rick. With extreme anxiety, she returned home just after her usual time to an empty house. She called Emma and Jake, but both their phones went straight to voicemail, and she began to worry. It was well after dinner time when she heard a car in the driveway. Looking out the window, she saw her kids getting out of her parents' car, with both her mom and dad in tow. They all came inside, and her mother opened the conversation. Judy, why didn't you tell us Dave was in the hospital? I didn't know. Silence settled over the room as everyone stared at Judy. Finally, her father spoke. Maybe you didn't know, but the fact that you're not rushing over there, or even curious about why he's there, tells me it's no surprise to you. Faced with this logic and 5 accusing stares, Judy could only slump into a chair and avert her eyes. She might as well have screamed, "Guilty." After another minute of silence, she fled to her room. She heard her parents making dinner for her children. Her mother tried to get her to come out of the locked room, but Judy couldn't face them. Eventually, when everything was quiet downstairs, she ventured out. The hum of her children's conversation abruptly stopped when she entered the room. Have you all eaten dinner? Her kids just stared silently at her. Finally, Emma spoke. Mom, you know how Daddy got hurt, don't you? I had no idea he was in the hospital. Silence returned as everyone, except maybe little Max, accepted that the lack of denial was as good as an admission. This time it was broken by Max's sobs, and Judy hurried over to wrap her arms around him. What's wrong, sweetie? It hurts me to see Daddy hurt so much. He's got broken ribs, a broken nose, and 2 black eyes. Judy recoiled in horror at what she hadn't prevented. Jake filled the silence. Why did you hurt Daddy, Mom? What did he do to you? Judy's response was automatic. He didn't do anything to me. Too slowly, she realized that once again, she'd failed to deny being the one who hurt Dave. In her mind, she blamed herself. She sent the kids to bed and drank herself into a stupor. The next day, Ronnie refused to discuss Dave at work but offered to talk about it at their usual motel later. Frustrated, Judy agreed. As soon as she got there, he tried to get physical with her, but she snapped at him until he stopped. He just shrugged his shoulders when she asked what instructions he'd given his two thugs. When she described Dave's injuries, Ronnie showed no interest or empathy. She stormed out and arrived back at the office 2 minutes before him. The tension between them for the rest of the day was obvious to everyone around. That night, she didn't worry when her children weren't home before her again. Her parents dropped them off, but as soon as they smelled dinner cooking, they left without a word. Her children gave monosyllabic answers to any question she asked. Whenever she entered the room, their conversation ceased. The next day, things were still frosty at work and uncomfortable at home. That night, she just sat at the kitchen table, pondering how to break the impasse with her kids. She was so deep in thought that she hardly noticed when they came home. She only snapped out of it when Emma noisily put a plate in front of her. She ate alone in the kitchen while the kids ate in front of the TV. She just couldn't handle those accusing stares. She shuddered to think what Dave was telling them. After another cold day at work, she returned home to a bustling house. Her mother greeted her at the door. "Are you going to feed your children today?" "Of course, Mother." "Good." Her mother left the house. Judy turned to see Max carrying a plate of cheese and crackers upstairs. "Hey, no food upstairs, you know that." "Daddy's hungry," Max replied as he continued up the stairs. That's how Judy discovered Dave was home. She busied herself making dinner, occasionally glancing at the stairs. It was only 12 steps, but it was a psychological chasm. At any given time, one or two of the kids were upstairs. Emma took Dave's food up. As they sat at the dining table, Max innocently asked, "If Daddy didn't do anything to you, why did you hurt him? Why won't you talk to him?" Judy had no answer to that. When Emma started to explain the concept of guilt to Max, Judy fled, leaving her half-eaten dinner. She walked for several hours. When she returned, all the kids were in bed. She needed some things from the master bedroom and bathroom, so she snuck upstairs and peered in the open door. Dave appeared to be asleep on his side, facing the doorway. The sight of his swollen face, with white strips holding his nose in place, pierced through to her conscience. The sound of his ragged breathing almost killed her. She quietly gathered her necessities and went to put them in the spare room directly across the hall. She returned to the master bedroom, intending to whisper a request for forgiveness to the man she'd once loved. A man whose current mental and physical pain she could have prevented. As she knelt beside the bed, she saw his eyes were open, staring at her. She fled again and couldn't sleep. She hadn't slept well in days, tormented by the thought of Dave's eyes boring into her through 2 walls and a corridor. When her relationship with Ronnie first became serious, she knew conflict with Dave was inevitable. She'd rehearsed what she would say to Dave. But now that the moment had arrived, it hit harder than she'd ever imagined. She forced Ronnie to talk to her the next morning, trying to get him to move up his plans to divorce his wife. But he was firm no divorce until after the election, and no admitting to an affair. If she wanted to divorce Dave now, that was up to her. He'd help with time off and money, but otherwise she was on her own. That's when Judy first suspected she might just be a casual fling for Ronnie. Although she wasn't convinced, the burning bridge behind her forced her to continue on her chosen path. She took time off to see a lawyer and arranged to have Dave served as soon as the papers were ready. She left the service entirely in the lawyer's hands to speed up the divorce. She kept her demands reasonable primary custody, with liberal visitation rights for him, a calculated child support and alimony and residency of the house until she was ready to move out, which would be just after the election next year. The next part of the story won't make sense unless you know the layout of the dealership where Ronnie and Judy worked. The front of the building is a massive showroom. Along the back wall are 4 glass-walled offices, end to end, with solid walls between them. On the far right is Ronnie's office, then Judy's, then 2 belonging to the admin manager and the service manager. The offices are long and narrow, with only one place to put a desk at the opposite end from the door, against the end wall. Because Ronnie's and Judy's doors are at opposite ends of their offices, their desks are essentially side by side with only a solid wall between them. The service center is around the back. Judy was busy typing away at a keyboard and didn't see Dave walk into the dealership. But he did walk in, right up to the reception desk. He leaned on it and just stared into Judy's office. One of the 2 receptionists recognized him, had coached her softball team in high school. She knew he was Judy's husband. though he'd never been there before. She tried to engage him in conversation, but he just stared neutrally at the offices. The receptionist couldn't tell if it was Judy or Ronnie that he was targeting. While she kept talking, the other girl at the front desk went to Judy's office and told her that Dave was there. Judy's head whipped around. From her vantage point, there was no doubt where Dave's eyes were focused. They bored into hers even from a distance. Judy quickly broke eye contact, but still felt his gaze on her. Without looking, she reached for the Venetian blind control and twisted it so he couldn't see her anymore. A minute later, she put one finger between two slats and peeked out. Both the girls at reception were whispering conspiratorially. Dave was still staring at her window, his familiar neutral expression showing through the bruises and bandages. With his stare burning through the blinds, Judy picked up the phone and called Ronnie. She told him to look out his window. "What's he doing here?" "I don't know, Ronnie. Get rid of him, it hurts." Ronnie put the phone down and strode out to the reception desk. "Mr. Ross, this is a private business. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Dave didn't acknowledge Ronnie in any way. He just kept staring. "Come on, don't make me call the cops." Without taking his eyes off Judy's window, Dave reached into his pocket and handed his phone to Ronnie. Ronnie lowered his voice. "So I slept with your wife. Get over it." The trouble was, Ronnie had no idea how loud his voice could be. Both girls at the desk heard his comment loud and clear. In her office, Judy, peeking through a crack in the Venetian blinds, saw both heads snap toward her. Then she saw Ronnie stride back to his office. 2 minutes later, she heard a commotion at reception. She created another crack and looked out. What she saw horrified her. Frank and Rick had Dave by an arm each and were dragging him toward the outer doors. Dave was traveling backward, staring at her the whole way. As he went out of sight, Judy thought to herself, "Serves him right. Why can't he just let me go?" Then she remembered that all her dialogues with Dave had been in her head. Until he caught her at the motel with Ronnie, he had no idea their marriage was even in trouble. With that shock, it was no wonder he was at a loss for words. Judy wasn't totally devoid of empathy, and she genuinely felt for Dave. She rushed to her door and exited her office. She saw Ronnie with a sadistic grin on his face. "No, Ronnie, no, not again. Let me handle it, woman." With that, Ronnie gestured for Judy to return to her office. She opened the blinds again and stewed. Ronnie canceled his afternoon appointments and just stayed in his office. Judy noticed a constant stream of employees coming to reception. Many small clusters formed and dispersed. She distracted herself from wondering what that was all about. At 1 p.m., 2 cops arrived and spoke to the receptionists. Ronnie must have seen them. They were invited into his office. The blinds were drawn. 15 minutes later, the cops left. Judy was dreading going home. So before she left, she asked if she could move into the motel unit the company rented permanently, the same unit she and Ronnie used. She snuck home before the kids got back from school and packed a suitcase, then sent a text to Dave and Emma, saying she wouldn't be home that night. Ronnie helped her unpack at the unit. Desperate for a distraction, she let him have his way with her. At 6:30 p.m., her mother called. Before she answered, Judy thought, "Typical of Dave to use my family against me. Where the hell are you, Judy? Why aren't you home to feed your kids?" I'm not coming home tonight. Dave can take care of them. Dave's in the hospital again. He'll be there for at least a week this time." "What?" "I'll be home as soon as I can." Judy pushed Ronnie off. "What did you do to him this time? The stubborn fool has to learn he can't mess with me." Judy dressed quickly and sprinted home, picking up takeout on the way. The first thing she noticed when she burst through the front door was all 3 kids sobbing in the living room, being comforted by her parents. Her mother intercepted her and led her into the kitchen. "What the hell is going on, Judy? You abandon our grandchildren while your husband is in the ICU? And then you come home with greasy food for their main meal of the day? What's going on?" "It's none of your business, Mother. Dave and I are going through a rough patch, that's all." The 2 women stared each other down for half a minute. Her mother broke the silence. "I noticed you weren't surprised to hear your husband is in the hospital. That tells me what the children said is true. You had something to do with Dave ending up in the ICU." "No, Mom. I had no idea Dave was in the hospital again." Silence settled over the conversation again. Finally, her mother broke it. "Well, aren't you at least a little curious about what your boyfriend did to your husband this time?" "What boyfriend?" "Come on, Judy. You reek of SX." Judy looked at the floor and remained silent. Well, since you're so interested, I'll tell you. This time, the doctors are pretty sure he has a fractured cheekbone and possibly a fractured skull. They're sure one of the ribs that was broken last time was pushed into his chest and punctured a lung. The ambulance driver told me they picked him up from an alley near your work. Tell me, Judy, what did the poor guy do to you to deserve this? Judy couldn't answer, she was too busy sobbing. Her mother sat in silence until Judy ran upstairs to her bedroom. There was blood on the sheets of the bed she hadn't slept in for 4 days. She screamed her pain into the pillow. She had no idea how long she stayed there, but finally, there was a soft knock at the door. It was her mother. I have to take Dad home. All this stress is causing his blood pressure to act up again. He almost fainted when he stood up just now. Okay, Mom, I'll see you out. By the time Judy got downstairs, her father was walking out the front door. He turned to give her a withering look but didn't say anything. While she was saying goodbye, the kids slipped off to bed. Judy sat and tried to think of a way out of this mess. The only way she could see was forward. Breakfast the next day was silent. When she got to work, she found out Ronnie would be gone for the day. Desperate for reassurance that her plan was still on track, she texted him, begging him to meet her at the motel that evening. She then texted her mother, asking her to pick up the kids after school and make them dinner because she had things to do. The reply was curt. Yes, good idea. Ronnie met her after work and reassured her that their plan was still on track. The police couldn't connect either of them to Dave's 2 beatings, and he didn't bring up her husband's latest assault. Sure, Ronnie had arranged it, but she could have stopped it simply by running after them as her husband was carried out the door. She let Ronnie have his way with her until after 9 p.m. After a shower, she went home. It was almost 10 when she arrived, and all 3 kids were awake, looking at her expectantly. Why aren't you in bed? Her mother answered for them. I let them stay up until you got home. They're anxious to know how their father is. I don't know. What? Didn't you go see him tonight? Judy's silence answered for her. So what did you do? Don't tell me you got me to cover for you while you went to see your lover while Dave is in the hospital. I never told you I was going to the hospital. Her mother swung around, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. With one hand on the handle, she said over her shoulder, You disgust me. I'm ashamed to call you my daughter. Don't ask me to look after your kids again unless it's so you can go to your husband and beg his forgiveness. Judy thought she was learning to cope with only 3 hours of broken sleep a night. Like I said, I never got to know Dave, but from what people say, he might have forgiven Judy if she'd just given up her plans. She didn't. From what she told me later, she thought she'd caused so much pain at that point that backing out would have made it all pointless. When Judy's mother called her at work the next day, she thought it might be to apologize. It wasn't. Judy, how could you be so heartless? What are you talking about, Mom? Your husband finally gets out of the ICU, and what does he get? A visit from his loving wife? No, he gets an ugly process server with divorce papers. Who are you, Judy? And what have you done with my daughter? In her pain, Judy had totally forgotten that her divorce was on autopilot. The lawyer had obviously followed her instructions and had Dave served as soon as the papers were ready. As a reflex, she tried to remove the immediate thorn in her side. Mom, can you look after the kids tonight so I can go see Dave? No, I bloody can't, Judy. Your father's in the same hospital as your husband. He had a heart attack today. They're going to put in stents tomorrow. Goodbye. Judy rushed home early to be there when the kids got off the school bus. The bus arrived without 3 familiar faces. Calls to 2 of their phones went straight to voicemail. 2 hours later, she got a text to pick them up at the hospital. They'd walked there after school. On the way home, she scolded them for making her worry. They just remained silent and stared out the car window. It was shortly after this that I became aware of the tragic story of Judy, Dave, and Ronnie. I was sitting in my office, wondering where my next story was going to come from. The world was going through an unusually quiet, peaceful period, and news was hard to find. My phone rang. It was an old friend from journalism school, Matt Ingram. He was good at what he did, but tended to focus on small-town issues where he could make a difference. He'd been in the regional center where our story takes place for about a year. The doctors and nurses at the hospital where Dave was treated were so appalled by his wife's behavior that they contacted Matt. With his usual talent, Matt quickly spoke to several people from the dealership and found out about Judy and Ronnie's affair, along with the 2 beatings Dave had suffered. No one came out and directly said it, but the fact that 3 witnesses saw Dave being carried out of the dealership by 2 of Ronnie's known associates led to certain conclusions. Matt tried to talk to Dave, but he refused. So Matt contacted the police to see where their investigation was at, only to be told there wasn't one. He submitted the story to his editor and had the pleasure of seeing it torn up. No negative stories would be published about Ronnie in that town. Matt immediately resigned and sent the story to me. I saw my editor, and Matt received an offer from our paper the next week. I cleared my desk and left for assignment in Hicksville 2 days later. From what Judy told me, the next week was rough for her. Her kids treated her like a pariah, and her social life was cut off by not having her mother to look after the children. She picked them up from the hospital every night. Ronnie was away on business every day, and the only time she saw him was one night when he managed to sneak into her house after the kids were in bed. That was the first time they spent the whole night together. She certainly craved the company. On Friday, Judy got a call from the school to come in for a semi-urgent discussion. That's when she found out they were very concerned about Emma's rapid weight loss and couldn't believe she'd been so negligent as not to notice. They also mentioned Jake's sudden tendency toward violence and that little Max was being bullied because he was always crying. Judy cried herself to sleep after that. All she could think to do was speed up the divorce and hope the trouble blew over. At first, Judy turned down an invitation to go out with 4 of her friends that Friday night. Dave was still in the hospital, and Ronnie was unavailable. She tried everything to get the kids to talk to her, but nothing worked. In frustration, she left the kids at home and went out with the girls. She left the name of the place with Emma in case it was too loud to hear her phone ring. She'd been there about an hour, fielding questions from her friends, who'd heard the rumors. She denied all knowledge of the violence against her husband. They finally relented and moved on to lighter topics when she noticed 2 of them looking over her shoulder. She turned around, and there was Dave. One eye was slightly black, the other completely black. A bandage covered one side of his face, and he was stooped, guarding his painful ribs. He was sitting at an adjacent table, just staring at her. In a panic, Judy swung back to her friends and made a huge mistake. Oh, just ignore him. Her friends saw her immediate reaction and heard her flippant comment. They also saw Dave's suffering and could only wonder at the commitment it must have taken to come there and make his silent protest. They'd made up their minds about Judy's honesty. One made an excuse to go to the bar, while the 2 who knew Dave best went over to talk to him. The rest just looked at Judy quizzically. Judy fled again. She paused outside the bar, wondering if she should offer Dave a ride, but her conscience wouldn't allow her to talk to him. Even though it was the decent thing to do, she just couldn't do it. As recently as 2 weeks ago, she told him she loved him to avoid suspicion. He now knew it had been a lie. Judy drove home. Her mother was there, looking after the kids. They hadn't seen each other in a week, and Judy suddenly realized she hadn't even asked about her father's health. How self-centered had she become? They got the kids to bed, and then Judy asked about her father, but tried to change the subject when her mother brought up Dave. Her mother wouldn't let it go, though. She asked Judy if Dave had done anything to warrant a divorce. Judy mentioned a few petty annoyances, but when she saw her mother wasn't convinced, she went on to explain that she'd simply fallen out of love with her husband and in love with someone else. She found lying to her mother easy, and certainly wasn't going to mention that she used Ronnie's attention as an opportunity to trade up, as it were. Her mother let her have it, airing her opinions about abandoning her marriage and children. No holds were barred, and Judy sat through it uncomfortably. She vehemently denied having anything to do with Dave's 2 beatings. At the end, she didn't ask whether her mother had discussed with her husband if he would forgive her. In her mind, the plan was intact. She did ask if Dave was coming home that night, and was coldly told that he was due to be released in 2 days, but had called earlier asking where she was. Judy realized that Dave must have snuck out of the hospital to go to the bar earlier. Judy did a lot of thinking over the next 2 days. She decided the decent thing to do was apologize to Dave for her infidelity, but point out that the beatings were the result of his own immature behavior. She would demand that he speak to the kids and explain that she had nothing to do with his pain. She thought there was a reasonable chance he would agree to that, and a small chance he'd beg her to stay. One thing was for sure, any aggression on his part would result in her threatening to reduce his share of the marital assets in the split. Dave had other plans. The night he was released from the hospital, Judy and Ronnie left work early and went to the unit. No longer needing to hide their relationship, they both walked out of the room together just after 7 p.m., to be greeted by a silent Dave, Emma, Jake, and Max, watching them from across the parking lot. Ronnie immediately strode toward them. All three kids stepped in front of Dave. He said something Judy couldn't hear, then stepped in front of the kids protectively. Ronnie looked at the three witnesses, turned around, and walked away. Judy slunk to her car and drove off. Dave took the kids out for a meal and returned to their home with them just before 9. Judy heard them come in, laughing and talking. She kept washing her dinner dishes. When she finished, she went into the living room, intending to separate Dave from the kids and present her ultimatum. The three kids stopped talking when she entered. There was no sign of Dave. When she asked where he was, they told her he'd taken his pain medicine and gone to bed. She tried in vain to get the kids to talk to her, but they wouldn't. She sent them to bed and called Ronnie for comfort. Exhausted, she decided to turn in early as well. On the upstairs landing, she saw the light was on in the spare room and that there was a pile of her clothes and toiletries on the bed. Vowing that this had to stop, she strode to the master bedroom door, but it was locked. She went back downstairs, retrieved the spare key from the kitchen, and armed herself with a rolling pin, just in case. Using the key, she opened the bedroom door. The light from the hallway revealed Dave lying in a sleeping bag on a mattress. As she processed the sight, the form in the bag rose to reveal Jake standing between her and Dave. Jake looked at the rolling pin and then hissed, "You will not hurt my dad again." Judy wanted to say it was all a mistake, that she would never hurt Dave again. But in Jake's eyes, she saw the futility of that. Instead, she retreated to her room, weeping. Did she sleep like a baby that night? What do you think? Dave was still unconscious when it was time to leave the next morning. The kids took turns would eat breakfast in the kitchen, while the other stood halfway up the stairs. It was so obvious that one was a guard that it broke Judy's heart. She left and spent the day planning a speech on how to redeem her kids' trust. She returned home at her usual time. Dave and the kids were talking in the living room. She barked at the kids to go into the kitchen. They looked at Dave, who nodded. When he painfully started to rise, she ordered him to stay away. Once the three kids were settled at the kitchen table, Judy stood, glaring down at them, facing the door with the table between her and it. She opened her mouth to begin her speech but saw her tormentor standing just outside the doorway. 2 weeks of guilt, self-loathing, frustration, and sleep deprivation caused something inside Judy to snap. The neutral expression on Dave's face was the final straw. With a strength she didn't know she had, she picked up the heavy glass fruit bowl from the center of the table and hurled it toward her tormentor. It slipped in her hand at the last moment, causing her aim to be off. In slow motion, she saw the bowl heading for the doorframe. Just before it struck, she looked at Dave's face. She swears now that the neutral expression turned to a smile. That was his only movement. The heavy bowl hit the frame, breaking into 2 pieces. One piece smashed harmlessly against the frame, but not the other. It deflected about 30 degrees and hit the undamaged side of Dave's face. Still in slow motion, Judy watched in horror as bright crimson blood sprayed out of a deep cut before her husband sank to his knees, then fell to his side. Life sped up again. The kids, initially stunned into silence, started shouting. Jake reacted first, jumping up and protectively standing over his father. Seeing the blood still pulsing from Dave's face, Judy instinctively grabbed a hand towel and rolled it up while striding to her husband. She intended to use it to stop the bleeding, but Jake raised his hands to ward her off. Determined, she pushed him back, causing him to fall hard. She knelt and pressed the towel to Dave's face. In a very unladylike manner, Emma tackled her mother off her father. Seeing that his angry sister was more than a match for their mother, Jake rose, went to the medicine cabinet, grabbed a sterile pad, and gently applied it to his father's face. Emma screamed at Max, "Call 911." Knowing how bad this was, Judy ran for the phone. By controlling the call, she hoped to just request an ambulance while keeping the police away. She had just put her hand on the phone when she heard Jake shout, "Use the phone upstairs, Emma!" In a moment of clarity, Judy realized they'd misinterpreted her actions as wanting to stop the call. Emma sprinted past her toward the stairs. Judy wanted to give chase, but Max stopped her the only way he could. He wrapped his arms around her lower legs. Judy tried to take a step but fell heavily when her legs wouldn't move. She lay there, screaming hysterically. Then she removed Max's arms, stood, and ran. That's the first time I saw Judy in person, one hand covered in blood, running to her car. I just arrived to request an interview. Seeing the bloody, screaming woman, I took the liberty of inviting myself in and took over Dave's treatment. The ambulance arrived, followed by the police. While Dave was taken away, the cops started asking questions. I arranged for Emma to call her grandmother to come look after them. That's how I heard firsthand what had happened to Dave this time. As the kids recounted how their mother had attacked their father, then allegedly tried to stop them from calling for help. I'd interviewed enough people by then to suspect that the local police might be a little too cozy with certain town figures. So I made a call to a contact in the state police. Within a few hours, 2 officers from the state's special unit showed up. These guys were known for stepping in when the local force got too comfortable. They arrived, questioned the kids again, and then left, but not before making sure they had all the information they needed. I stayed long enough to see the children finish giving their statements, then took Emma and Jake to see their dad in the hospital. That's when I got the only words I'd ever hear directly from him. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper as he lay there, battered but still holding on. I took them back home, then stepped away from the situation, letting the authorities take over. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Judy had fled to Ronnie's house. She was greeted at the door by Ronnie's wife, Pam. Thinking quickly, Ronnie explained to Pam that Judy was an employee with an abusive husband. Pam, with no reason to doubt her husband, offered their home as a refuge for the night. Judy, in her distressed state, accepted without a second thought. Judy was too distraught to go to work the next day, but Ronnie did, leaving the 2 women alone in the house. Just after lunchtime, Pam was in the kitchen when she heard a scream and a crash. She rushed into the living room to find Judy lying on the floor in a faint. Looking around to see what had caused it, Pam eventually looked out the window. There, standing outside their fence, was a man whose face was almost entirely covered in bandages, staring intently at the house. Pam waited for Judy to regain consciousness, then asked her what was happening. Through her incoherent mumbling, Pam caught the word husband and pieced together enough to understand that the man outside was Judy's abusive spouse. She called the police to remove him, and then called Ronnie. Ronnie arrived first and stormed into the house, ignoring Dave outside, to start damage control. The police arrived shortly after, recognized Dave, and came to the door to ask Pam if the man outside was indeed her husband. Pam, innocently, said yes, and to her shock, Dave was the one who got arrested. Ronnie knew he had to keep a lid on this whole mess, so he immediately left to organize a lawyer for Judy. That night, Judy stayed at the motel, stewing over the train wreck her life had become. She couldn't believe that Ronnie, who she thought loved her, had so quickly turned cold and distant. She tried to hold on to the thought that at least she still had Ronnie, but the realization that she might have been nothing more than a convenient fling for him was starting to sink in. 2 days later, things took a sharp turn. My photographs of the night of Dave's final assault led to Ronnie's thugs being apprehended very quickly. To save their own skins, they wasted no time rolling over on Ronnie, implicating him in the attacks on Dave. Ronnie was arrested and denied bail as the severity of his actions and the influence he held in the town worked against him. When my article was published in the state's leading newspaper that weekend, Ronnie's wife left him faster than a rat fleeing a sinking ship. The dealership survived, but Ronnie's reputation and influence were in tatters. Judy continued her lonely existence, moving between the motel and the few friends who still spoke to her. She was living in a daze, struggling to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly. She brokered an uneasy deal with her mother to get some of her belongings from her old house, but she never saw Dave or her children again. When the police, tipped off by my article, questioned her about Dave's first 2 beatings, Judy was honest. She had nothing to hide and was charged with 2 counts of failure to report a crime and as an accessory to assault. Dave was granted interim custody of the 3 kids. Judy was torn about pressing charges on Dave's direct assault against her, but his mind was finally made up by child services. One particularly militant local officer took Judy's side and started proceedings to get custody granted to her, despite the wishes of all 3 kids. Realizing that him having custody was in the best interest of the kids, Dave went ahead with pressing charges on the grounds that it would increase the chances of a favorable outcome. When the child services officer persisted in trying to take Judy's side, Dave began sitting outside her house, staring at it silently. Although the police moved him on, it had the desired effect. Soon, neighbors reported loud arguments coming from the house, and her husband was heard yelling, "Let me get this straight. The woman who cheated on him, let him get beaten up twice, then tried to kill him in front of the kids, and you're still taking her side." An hour after this exchange, the child services officer was seen lugging suitcases to her car, and the case was dropped. Judy still hadn't worked up the courage to end it all when the circuit court came to town. With the evidence so overwhelming, all 4 parties, Ronnie, Frank, Rick, and Judy, pled guilty. Frank and Rick got 3 years, Judy got 4, and Ronnie got 8. No one was there to see Judy taken from the dock down the special stairs to the holding cells. It wasn't until this point that the full reality hit her. Judy wrote a long letter to her children, apologizing for what she had done to their family. She wrote another to Dave, but this one contained no apologies. Things were too far gone for that. Instead, she begged him to take care of the kids. Dave, on the other hand, became somewhat of a local celebrity. He had no shortage of attention from the local women, and he even went on a few dates when his family business allowed it, or when Emma and Jake insisted he do so. When one particular lady caught his eye, Emma and Jake confronted her one night, grilling her thoroughly. At the end of the interrogation, they pronounced her worthy of continuing to see their dad. Things went well between them, and Emma even started dropping hints to Dave about proposing. As for Ronnie, what can I say? He was in a 4-person cell, and quickly learned that being a small-town bully didn't count for much in the state prison system. He was also starting to feel like a heavyweight contender past his prime, constantly getting battered around the ring. A few days later, he got into a fight in the prison yard. That was his last fight, apparently. Trying to intimidate a 350-pound inmate is never a good idea. And that's how it all ended. Judy, once at the center of this storm, now sat in a prison cell, reflecting on the choices that led her there. Dave, battered but unbroken, found a way to move on with his life, surrounded by the people who mattered most. And Ronnie, well, he got what was coming to him, proving that the high and mighty can fall just as hard as anyone else. Thanks for watching this incredible story of betrayal, revenge, and resilience. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. What do you think was justice served in the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.